All right, moving on tonight, turning now to Flint's former emergency manager and now outgoing DPS manager Darnell Early. He is taking a lot of blame for what happened in Flint. He dodged a subpoena to appear in Washington this week. He's also taking blame for the downfall of Detroit public schools. He resigned this week. We had him on MiWeek last March, where he said he was confident that DPS would come out of emergency management by the time his 18 months were up. Take a look.
By the time you get to my position in this, we're dealing with a situation where there are a number of variables that are different. The city's situation has been, for the most part, resolved, so that's not an overbearing concern. We've got the Educational Coalition that's working, looking at this issue as well. So there are a lot of other factors that are in play now than there were during the terms of some of my predecessors.
All right, they are debating bills about Detroit Public Schools in the legislature today, and also names are being tossed around for the next EM. Who even wants that job? But first off, as we talk about Darnell Early, I want to ask both of you, do you think that he has been unfairly targeted or scapegoated in the Flint and the DPS situation? Nolan, let me start with you.
Well, in Flint, I think clearly the MEDQ was at fault here. You had Mark Edwards saying that at the hearing, almost all the responsibility rests with the MEDQ. I don't know how Darnell Early would have known they weren't putting the right chemicals here. The local officials, Jim Lynch of our paper, had a very detailed story last week. I'm talking about how the local officials, the mayor, Halling, pushed and pushed and pushed for this water transfer. I don't know that Darnell Early didn't do exactly what he was asked to do in Flint, and that is balance the books. At DPS, I think he was a little clueless, a little unaware of what was going on in the schools. But when you talk about his mission, did he balance the books? He eliminated the structural deficit. I think he had to go. I think the governor's got to get this package of bills passed. He's got to build support in Detroit for his proposals for DPS. That wasn't going to happen with Darnell Early sitting there. That's why I think yesterday he said we're getting rid of the EAA. That also was an irritant point, and he wasn't going to get this legislation through or with any sort of Detroit support without getting rid of that. So I think what you've seen the governor do is putting all of his efforts towards getting this legislation passed.
Do you think that Darnell Early has been unfairly piled on?
Well, I mean, I think that he's become a symbol of these two issues, and because he's the one link between them, I mean, he sort of shines a little brighter than everybody else. He was in Flint when this decision was made. So, I mean, ultimately, look, the buck stops on his desk at some point, even though he's not the person who made the decision about whether to put chemicals in the water or not. He signed off on the papers to make the switch. So you got to take responsibility for that. And of course, he's been the EM here in Detroit for more than a year, and things have not gotten better. Eliminating the structural deficit is important, but at the same time, the debt has continued to grow, the overall debt in the system, what it owes. So I don't know if it's unfair. I mean, I think it's bigger than him. Both issues are much bigger than him, but I don't think there's anything wrong with calling someone to account for their job. The other thing in DPS is, was he going to be able to go forward and do his job? I mean, I think that's the measure.
And that was the big question that we had actually asked him several times when he was with us last year was, you have this plan, but really how can you implement it? So the next question is
so
then,
politically hobbled.
Who wants this job? Who's going to be the next EM? We heard from Bridge Magazine, they tossed out a couple of names, Tanya Allen from Skillman Foundation, Charlie Beckham, head of neighborhoods in Detroit. But who would really want this job, and what really can you do in this job?
Well, you can't do much of anything. What's key here is whether this legislation gets passed. The emergency manager is pretty much done in Detroit. Get this legislation passed, wipe out the debt, and I think the state is just dying to run out of Detroit once that's done. But the Republican lawmakers have to give their governor a victory on this. I mean, they've got a weakened governor, a governor who's under attack. This is key. A key agenda item. It has to get done or the state's going to be in a world of trouble financially. They've got to quit playing politics and worrying about the fall, because if they go into the fall with the governor in the shape he's in today, they're going to lose the House anyway. They need to give him a victory on this one.
So the great tragedy in Detroit schools was, I think, the more recent tragedy in Detroit schools has been the work of this tremendous coalition that came together last year to come up with a way to go forward in the district, that we didn't build on that. We didn't build on the broad spectrum of people who were behind that. We didn't build on all the work that they did. And that plan is essentially just sitting on the shelf like 30 other plans to fix DPS. I think that's the way forward. I think you put a superintendent in place, not another EM, an actual superintendent. And that person ought to work through the mayor's office and the governor's office to rebuild the parts of that coalition to start talking about what kind of school district we need and can build between the city and the state
that is the,
for kids here.
That is the plan. I mean, the first assignment of the new emergency manager, we're told, is to find that person, that superintendent, who will be the next person to try to transition this district back to a normal
But again,
controlled.
the landscape here, and the political landscape, which is always important in DPS, is that you've got all these different constituencies that came to the table in good faith, came up with a plan and came up with ideas, and saw them, for the most part, not take shape. There are big parts of that coalition plan that are not in this legislation, that are not on the table anymore. And I think that's a really missed opportunity to get something done that no one's going to get everything they want. That plan included lots of things that individuals on the committee didn't necessarily love, but they were willing to sign off on it because it was about moving forward together.
So they're starting to debate this in Lansing today. We're going to hear testimony from Mayor Mike Duggan. State Superintendent Brian Whiston is also going to be up there, and they're going to be debating this now for the next several weeks. Before we leave this topic of conversation, you did mention this, but it bears repeating again, that part of this negotiation and getting Democrats on board with this reform package in Lansing was talking about dismantling the EAA, which is the state reform district that's been kind of plodding along since 2011. It has 15 schools that is in Detroit. How key do you think that is to dismantling that, to getting some of this legislation passed?
I mean, it was a failed experiment, and we at the News, we questioned from the beginning the concept of it. You take the 15 worst schools and try to fix them when you had an overcapacity of schools. We thought the best approach is to close the 15 worst schools and start working on the next level up. I think there's a certain point at which a school reaches, you can't bring it back.
The problem is if you close those schools, I mean, you have a geographic problem,
those
right?
kids have to go somewhere.
Those kids got to go somewhere, and there aren't other schools in their neighborhood. So that wasn't a very realistic.
You close the building, is what I'm saying. You close the building and move other students, other teachers, other principals.
The thing with the EAA is, the thing that really
Last word
rubs
on
me
this.
the wrong way on the EAA is, these were schools that were awful before. They have been awful since I covered DPS back in the early 90s. And the people who were the strongest critics of the EAA didn't seem all that worked up about those schools when they were under the board's control. And we've got to get past this idea of who's in control and start talking about what happens in the schools. What can we do to fix these? The EAA was an effort to turn these schools around. I think it was, it turned out not to work. But going back to what we had before is not a solution either.
All right, well, we'll be watching what happens in Lansing.